As time presses forward and technology progresses, video games get increasingly more complex. We've had experiences with games now that we may not have even thought possible 20 years ago. But yet, with all this innovation, one thing has remained a constant. The Mario series has continued to redefine what a video game can be. Super Mario Bros. On the NES introduced millions of people to not only platformers, but video games in general. It contained simple and intuitive gameplay that anybody could understand and enjoy. It also lent itself well to limitless replays for that same reason. Its structure combined with its straightforward control scheme encouraged players to master the game over time. The game was an instant classic upon release, and its influence on gaming as a medium cannot be overstated. When the time came to develop the first ever 3D Mario game, I'm certain that the legacy that Mario 1 left behind loomed in the back of the team's mind. Due to the limited cartridge space of the Nintendo 64, just 15 stages were able to fit in the final game. This meant that the team had to use these stages for all they were worth, and that meant rethinking the very conventions of a Mario game. Accounting for every possible way that a player may interact with an environment is much harder to do in a 3D plane than a 2D one, so the team opted to make the stages and objectives more open-ended. In this case, the limitations of the hardware benefited the fun factor of the game greatly. Clearing levels didn't just mean running and jumping around, it meant exploring and immersing yourself in a whimsical set of worlds. Super Mario 64 went on to be the best-selling game on the Nintendo 64, and it along with Ocarina of Time are probably the games most people associate the console with. It is still discussed and played often, both amongst casual fans who remember the game from their childhood, and the passionate modders and speedrunners who know the game better than the back of their hand. Mario 64 was my first 3D Mario experience, and for that I hold it very dear to my heart. To me, it represents pure childhood joy and wonder in video game form. As a result, I find myself replaying it often. It's earned itself a permanent spot in my personal Nintendo 64's cartridge slot because of how much I do. Even with all the great experiences out there waiting to be had, I still find myself yearning to go back to a simpler time. A time where nothing else mattered aside from exploring Peach's castle to my heart's content and stopping Bowser once and for all. Super Mario 64 begins right outside the doors of the princess's castle. It's a serene courtyard that offers the player plenty of space to come to grips with the unique control scheme. Your experimentation will be accompanied by the sounds of a constant flow of water and birds chirping off in the distance. It creates a warm atmosphere that allows you to explore for as little or as long as you'd like. At this stage in the game, you lack the knowledge that the princess has disappeared. It's as if the game wants to comfort you into letting your imagination loose. The area makes for a fantastic learning environment for Mario's moveset, which is critical to develop. 3 dimensions allowed for incredible depth to be added to how Mario can maneuver throughout the stages in the game. See, there really wasn't anything like Super Mario 64 at the time of its release. Although 3D platformers weren't exactly new in 1996, the way that you moved in them was nothing like what's present in Super Mario 64. They were controlled just like any other game, which was with the D-pad. 3D games were experiencing growing pains in this era, as consoles and controllers hadn't really caught up to the transition. D-pads are far from ideal for controlling 3D games, because they, like other buttons, are digital inputs. Digital inputs are only capable of 2 states, pressed and unpressed. Pressing down on the button executes the action, and not pressing it does nothing. There is no middle ground here. The action is either being executed or it isn't. This makes tight platforming in a 3-dimensional plane difficult, since you have no control over how much your character moves. Nintendo understood this, and Mario 64 had the benefit of being developed in tandem with the Nintendo 64 console. The final controller features an analog thumbstick, which allows for specific, yet simultaneously intuitive movement. Depending on how far you press the thumbstick from its neutral position, Mario will move in accordance. If digital inputs could either be at 0 or 100, the analog stick could be at 0, 100, and everything in between. This not only revolutionized 3D platformers, but it revolutionized 3D gaming as a whole. It is still a control setup we use to this day, and we have yet to discover a better method of control. The nuance of Super Mario 64's movement goes deeper than the thumbstick though. There are a plethora of new moves at your disposal. You can triple jump, long jump, backflip, side flip, dive, ground pound, kick, punch, etc. These moves already provide you with a host of options in any given platforming scenario, but many of them can be chained together flawlessly. Performing a triple jump or side flip into a dive is endlessly satisfying. The star, wall kicks will work in Cool Mountain is an excellent showcase of how fluid the movement is. You'll first wall jump, then correctly space out a triple jump to clear a giant gap while still maintaining enough height to reach the wall above. You can then kick off that wall to reach the star. These moves flow seamlessly into each other in this section, and this is one of my favorite stars to go for in the entire game for that reason. The development team knew that creating a satisfying moveset was crucial to the quality of the game. The majority of the development period was actually spent on refining Mario's movement, with the stages almost being thrown together towards the end. Their efforts ultimately paid off, and considering that this was the very first game of its kind, their success is incredibly impressive. However, I can't say that it's absolutely perfect. There's a bit of jank when you need to quickly change the direction you're moving in, and I won't lie, it can be very bothersome. Having to snap the thumbstick in the opposite direction causes Mario to make a very wide turn when moving at full speed, but on narrow platforms, this can be a death sentence. This one little move has killed me on multiple occasions, and it adds this layer of impenetrable clunk to the movement. No matter how many times I play this game, I can never really get used to it. There is a way around this though. If you let Mario come to a complete stop before moving the stick, he will just snap around without making the wide turn. I just don't always remember to do this, and it can take you out of your rhythm. I also take issue with Mario's mobility while in midair. The direction and speed at which you move are the sole influencers of where your jump will take you. This may seem obvious, but the problem is that there's no way to influence where you land after performing the jump. Mario feels incredibly stiff while in the air, and it can make precise platforming rather difficult. The only possible way to perform any midair correction is by kicking, which can only take you backwards slightly. The dive grants you further horizontal clearance, but that's only if you intended on going the way Mario is facing. It's entirely possible to master the game's movement systems, but that doesn't make them imperfect. I believe that difficulty in games should come from their level design and objectives, and not having to grapple with the controls. Of course, we can't fault the designers too hard for this, as this was one of the first attempts at a game like this. Other than these relatively minor blemishes, the movement in Super Mario 64 is great. It's simple and intuitive, and that was possibly the most important thing it could have been, given the era the game was released in. But what I find most compelling about the game's movement is how it is used to interact with the stages. 2D Mario games had very simple movement systems. You can walk, run, and jump. There was no triple jump, long jump, side flip, etc. In order to make the games fun, the developers had to focus on intricately designing challenging levels around this limited moveset. The simplicity of the moves combined with repeatedly playing through the same levels over time makes players breeze through these stages in a matter of seconds. In contrast to the structure of 2D Mario, 64 features open sandbox stages, where objectives can be completed in mostly any order. As such, each playthrough of this game could look wildly different than the last. As you get better at moving, you'll pick up on all kinds of new strategies to get stars that aren't necessarily intended. A good way to think about it is that the 2D Mario games rely on its level design to make movement fun, while 64 relies on its movement to make the level design fun. The movement opening up so many possibilities within the game is a clear indication of what I believe to be the game's core thesis: variety. Variety can be found all throughout your time with Super Mario 64. There's variety in level motifs, variety in its objectives and how you complete them, and variety in how you experience the game in its entirety. But in order to make this variety and player freedom as potent as it is, it was important to introduce the game's format properly. This is something that the game does excellently in its first few stages. Bob-omb Battlefield starts you out in an open area where you can practice stomping on enemies, and then has you cross a narrow bridge with an enemy on it you can choose to kill. You then are taught that speed is key in some circumstances, when the Chain Chomp lunges at you as you pass by. The same thing applies on the Seesaw Bridge, because if you're too slow you'll slide off. It also integrates the narrow architecture of the previous bridge as a test to combine all of the knowledge you've acquired thus far. Ascending the mountain can serve to teach you many different things. Some players may try to jump over the rolling balls, while others may opt to simply walk around them. In both cases, you are learning valuable lessons. After getting a bit higher, you no longer have the option to walk around them, and must properly time jumps to clear them. This is a great environment to experiment with some of the more complex jumps, because your punishment is not an automatic death, but rather falling down a level or so. Just a bit higher up, gaps in the floor are integrated, so you'll have to contend with the balls while also ensuring you will not fall down below. Once you finally make it to the top, you'll encounter King Bob-omb. He's a slow-moving boss that doesn't directly inflict damage on the player, so he makes for a perfect beginner fight. While this level may seem like a cakewalk to those of us who have been playing 3D games forever, it's important to remember that many of the people who played this game upon its release had never seen anything like it. Whomp's Fortress serves as a nice contrast to Bob-omb Battlefield by establishing verticality as a core facet of its design. Bob-omb Battlefield starts out significantly more open, while Whomp's Fortress encourages you to start ascending it basically immediately. Once you clear the platforming section of the level on the way up to the top, you'll encounter a seemingly innocuous Whomp. The openness of this particular section affords you multiple options as to how you can deal with it. You can either bait out its attack to ground pound it, jump over it, or even just run right past it. Around the corner, you'll find another Whomp on a much more narrow path that is harder to just run past. Most new players will be forced to engage in a battle with it, wherein they will learn about how to defeat it. Once you find your way to the top of the structure, what do you know, the boss is a giant Whomp. Now you have acquired all the knowledge you will need to defeat the boss, all because of two smartly placed enemies. I had never considered why some enemies were placed in certain locations, or even why certain stages or levels were designed the way they were until I examined Super Mario 64 through the lens of it anticipating itself being somebody's first 3D game. Looking at it this way demonstrates how intelligently designed it is at times, to the point where I'm left dumbfounded. The camera setup may get a lot of rightfully earned criticism nowadays, but even in spite of its issues, I happen to believe it is quite fantastic. Let's return to Bob-omb Battlefield, and I'll explain my reasoning. As you spawn into the stage, the camera will be positioned behind and to the right of Mario, in a manner that makes the stage appear vast. At this particular angle, it is perfectly clear where Mario is at, where you need to be going, and where any movement will place you after it is executed. As you round the corner and cross the bridge, the camera will move to the opposite side, which allows you to judge exactly how much space you have on the bridge, and in no uncertain terms how you need to tilt the stick to move forward. Finally, as you climb the mountain, the camera will position itself to allow you to see incoming balls rolling down the hill so you can plan accordingly. Snowman's Land is a snowy valley with a mountain in the center of it, and most of your time in this level will be spent wandering the more open area. The camera will frequently have to adapt to the direction you're walking in, as this level is kind of shaped like a plate. I find that it always positions itself to show exactly what I need it to as I explore without any extra adjustment. The camera is positioned especially well in this stage as you ascend the mountain. You'll have to time jumps over these constantly moving ice blocks, and it's very easy to determine your jump timing in no small part thanks to the camera angle. Crossing the icy bridge where the snowman tries to blow you off is even easier, because the camera is facing directly to the side of the penguin, so you can always see if it is adequately protecting you from gusts of air. Another example of the camera at its best is when you spawn into Big Boo's haunt. You're placed right in front of this colossal haunted mansion, and the camera is positioned directly behind Mario at a low angle. It really helps to sell the atmosphere of this level. Even if this shot doesn't provide any practical utility, I think it's evidence of the camera working as intended far more often than unintended. Modern 3D games have refined player-controlled cameras to near perfection, and I think that's why the instances of the camera malfunctioning stick out so hard to us. But I think it's important for us to realize how great this camera system still is, as it established the conventions still used today. It's honestly really damn impressive it works as well as it does. In the 2D Mario games, the camera looking onto all the action presented enemies as more of a threat, because there was only so much you could do to avoid them. A 3D environment presents a bit of a problem in terms of enemy design, since you don't have to either jump over them or kill them. You can just walk around them, trivializing them entirely. Mario enemies don't exactly present interesting challenges, so the motivation to avoid them is strong in basically everybody. What the developers did to solve this issue was a stroke of pure genius. Simply make them drop a coin. Previously, taking damage would result in Mario losing his power-up. But since power-ups have taken a backseat in this game and are on a timer, he now has a health bar. Coins are the primary way you'll be replenishing your health, but they can also be used to contribute to a hidden star found in every level, the 100 coin star. This converts enemies into a utility rather than a threat, but I think that's totally fine in a game more focused on collecting and exploration than action and platforming. This is a great system for managing player health, but there is one issue I have with it. When you're swimming in water, your oxygen level is tied directly to your health, which means that returning to the surface will replenish both your oxygen and your health. If you're on the verge of death, you can simply jump in the water, swim around a little bit, and then go back up to full health in a matter of seconds. It isn't a huge deal since it can only be done in water stages, but it bothers me because it would have been such an easy fix. Just make the oxygen meter its own unique entity. Wouldn't you know it, I found myself the perfect segue into a discussion of the water stages. The first you'll likely encounter is Jolly Roger Bay, which you'll immediately notice has a much different tone than the other stages. It's less concerned with having you platform and testing you on your skill, instead inviting you to revel in its slower pace. The music creates the perfect atmosphere to aimlessly swim about and just explore the stage to your heart's content. Wet Dry World is one I enjoy quite a bit, particularly because of how it fuses the slower pace of Jolly Roger Bay and Dire Docks with the more exciting platforming found in other stages. Its central gimmick revolves around raising and lowering the water level, and as a result, the level feels like a giant puzzle box. Although I prefer the feeling of exploring a giant sandbox, I have to admit that I enjoy some of the more linear sections of this game, primarily the Bowser stages that precede his fights. These stages offer by far the most challenging platforming gauntlets in the game, all while building Bowser up as an imposing threat. I've gestured at this game's non-linear design for a bit now, so let's explore that. The very first example crops up in Bob-omb Battlefield. Who could have seen that coming? The first star you're expected to complete is Big Bob-omb on the summit. However, along your path you'll encounter the Chain Chomp who's guarding a star. A first-time player may not be sure what's expected of them here, but if you know what you're doing, this star is essentially a freebie. This is typically the first star I grab on fresh save files, just because of how easy it is. The freedom afforded to the player through this structure is liberating. If you're just looking to do a simple 70-star run, you have a tremendous amount of choice over what stars you have to complete. There are only a handful of stars that are absolutely mandatory, namely the Bowser battles and the Bowser submission in Dire Docks. However, there are stars that will need to be obtained in order to have enough to progress. They just aren't mandatory in the same way as the stages I just listed. For example, in Big Boo's Haunt, you'll have to kill Big Boo inside the mansion for the first star, which then unlocks his fight in the merry-go-round. Assuming you know where to go, you can then unlock his final fight on the top balcony of the mansion. For many of the stages in this game, clearing the first star is necessary in order to acquire all the stars that the stage has to offer. If you're the type of person who likes to do clean sweeps of stages rather than going all over the place, you're sadly unable to do that in the first half of the game. Some stars are gatekept by power-ups, and these power-ups cannot be unlocked until you reach a specific stage or total star count. To use Bob-omb Battlefield as an example one last time, you cannot get Mario Wings to the Sky without having unlocked the wing cap. In order to unlock the wing cap, you need to have gotten at least 10 stars and discovered the entrance to the secret stage. But there are only 5 stars you can get from this stage, so you'll have to seek stars elsewhere. Another example is the Jet Star in Jolly Roger Bay. To get this star, you'll need the metal cap to withstand the strong current. Well, at least if you want to complete it the intended method. This is the game's way of getting the player to mix up the order in which they tackle objectives. But there's also another approach that they take that is far more intrusive, and it's one of the main aspects of the game that is heavily critiqued: the boot-out system. Originally, I wrote about a page and a half tearing this system apart, but after some re-evaluation, I find myself a bit conflicted on it. So allow me, if you will, to take you through both sides of the debate, and hopefully we can arrive at some kind of conclusion. First, let's define what we mean. In Super Mario 64, collecting a main objective star will kick you out of the stage you're in. You will then either have to jump back into the painting you just left, or go to a new one entirely. This is reminiscent of how jumping on a flagpole would take you back to the world map in the 2D Mario games. But given this game's shift to more open stages, it doesn't make as much sense. Most objectives in a stage can be collected at any point, so why should the player have to repeat the beginning of the level 6 or 7 times? Well, there are a few factors to consider that complicate the answer to that question. Many will point out the fact that new level assets need to be loaded in between missions that change the stage drastically. A few examples are the tower in Womp's Fortress, the ship in Jolly Roger Bay, and the submarine in Dire Dire Docks. I'm not a game developer, so I can't say with any credibility that the Nintendo 64 can or can't handle loading these structures while having the player in the stage. For the sake of this argument, let's assume that it can't handle it. In these specific cases, I think it's totally understandable to boot the player out, especially since in all the examples I provided, these are the very first stars of their respective stages. So there may be some value in making a player repeat the beginning of the stage if it's their first time playing. However, I do not see why it would be necessary to then apply that system to every other star in the game. In the 2D Mario games, having to repeat levels helped the player master the control scheme and improve with each and every run. In Super Mario 64, there's much more open space with limited platforming challenges. This means that there's less for the player to do while traveling to the next objective, which exacerbates the feeling of repetition. It isn't as big of a deal in the beginning stages because you will seldom follow the exact same path multiple times, but the repetition is much more egregious in the linear platforming stages of the late game. Now, you could argue that this repetition was intended to have a similar effect that the 2D games had, developing your platforming skills. The problem is that in the 2D games, being forced to replay levels existed as a punishment for death. In Super Mario 64, you're forced to replay these levels as a punishment for death and for accomplishing your objective. Having to replay the beginning section of Tick Tock Clock a million times gets dull really quickly. I'm left questioning why the boot out system was applied to every star in the game, save for a few. So let's examine some of the arguments made in favor of the system. The first, and what I think is the strongest, is that it contributes to the feeling that each star is rewarding, and it helps to draw clear lines between the objectives. This makes getting a specific star feel like a deliberate action that is helping you to get closer to completing the game, and that is a great quality of the system. It also encourages you to jump between stages more frequently and tackle stars in basically any order, which is closer to the intended way of experiencing the game. By jumping between stages frequently, you will also develop a deep familiarity with Peach's Castle, which may not be as strong otherwise. Peach's Castle is a big part of what makes this game so charming and enjoyable, and I think that the game forcing you to interact with it as it stands now is critical. Finally, Super Mario 64 was designed to be a game that's fun to play, not necessarily to beat. It's incredibly easy to boot up, collect a few stars, and close out of, and I think the boot out system contributes to that. This is precisely why Mario 64 is one of my most replayed games, despite having only fully beaten it a handful of times. Although I find myself more in agreement with the anti-boot out side of the debate, I wouldn't be able to advocate for its removal without fully understanding how it would impact the game. To get a feel for how Super Mario 64 would play without such a restrictive boot out system, I downloaded the fan-made PC port of the game. This port contains a ton of customization options, one of which allows for the removal of the boot out system entirely. Upon collecting a star, you're faced with a prompt asking if you would like to stay in the stage or return to Peach's Castle. This works wonders for the game's pacing, but yet it still manages to make each new star you found feel important. There's still the little celebratory music and pause that happens in the vanilla game, but you aren't forced out of the stage. I think this is the perfect compromise for that dilemma, so much so that it feels like a moot point in the discussion now. It also maintains the ability to jump in and out of the game as you please. However, the implementation isn't perfect. That's hardly the fault of the developers though. It's a product of the stage design. The placement of the stars can occasionally necessitate the game to boot you out. An example is in the star In the Deep Freeze in Snowman's Land. Collecting this star is a piece of cake, but after grabbing it, you'll be unable to leave the ice block because you can't grip the side of the walls. The levels also require being refreshed too often to be able to do a clean sweep in one or even two different stars. In spite of its flaws, this revision of the boot out system benefits the game greatly, and is my preferred way to play now. Structural issues aside, I love the open system this game offers. I believe it was a great direction to take the series in, and it was executed fabulously. But the distinct stage motifs and non-linearity found throughout the game only contribute partially to why I believe the game's thesis to be variety. Throughout your time with Super Mario 64, your experience is grounded in a consistently fun and engaging hub world, Peach's Castle. The castle helps to thread all of these clashing level aesthetics together by portraying their entrance as traveling to another world via the paintings. It's essentially the sole reason that the game has the whimsical feeling it does when you play. The castle is massive in scope, but yet none of the space goes unused. The music that plays while you're traversing the castle hallways conveys both the prestige of the princess and her castle and the wonder of exploration. I often find myself humming the theme as I make my way through. A strong atmosphere is an important part of creating a good hub world, but what I also admire about the castle is how it handles progression. The easier, more open stages are placed in the main room of the castle, while the more linear and difficult stages are placed towards the top. You have to get 10 stars to access the first Bowser fight, which then brings you down to the basement. You have to complete that next Bowser fight as well before finally gaining access to the top of the castle. There's no way to just accidentally go from a stage like Cool Mountain to Rainbow Ride if you're a new player. Accessing new areas of the castle is a very deliberate action, and the fact that you don't quite know what lurks around the corner makes exploration of it enticing. I think it handles progression especially well in the very early moments of the game. When you enter the castle for the first time, you'll take notice of doors that require just 1, 2, or 3 stars to be unlocked. You'll head into Bob-omb Battlefield and collect whatever star strikes your fancy, and then you'll more than likely want to check out what lies beyond the doors you can now access. It's a perfect way to motivate players to do things out of order. But easily the best part of Peach's Castle is the sheer volume of secrets hidden within it. These secrets can range from talking to a random NPC to discovering entire stages. There's an indescribable magic to finding these secrets for yourself, and it's why the castle is such a revered hub world. These secrets are mostly optional, although there are a handful of mandatory ones, which I think is great. It requires all players to explore the castle thoroughly, even if they otherwise wouldn't have. The first secret that many will likely find is the hidden slide level just off the main room of the castle. There's a sign in the room that informs the player of the existence of secret stars, and that the entrance to one of them is in the room with you. Jumping through this decoy-stained window transports you into the slide level. I was elated when I found this star on my first playthrough, and it motivated me to comb through the castle to the best of my ability. Unlocking new sections of the castle remained exciting as a result, and it's one of the main memories I still have from that playthrough. I also find that the most memorable stages in the game for me are entered through unconventional means. Instead of walking through a door and jumping into a painting, Big Boo's haunt has you enter the castle courtyard and ground pound a specific boo to free a tiny cage. Walking up to this cage will presumably shrink you down and bring you to the stage. In the basement of the castle, there's a yellow rabbit named Mips who can be chased down and grabbed for a star. That isn't an easy feat though, as he'll likely juke you out with ease. He runs on a set path, and at one point he brings you to a seemingly dead end, until you realize that the wall is actually a painting. Jumping into it will take you to shifting sandland, which makes me love it even more than I already do. But easily my favorite entrance to any stage in the game can be found on the upper floor of the castle. You'll walk into a room with a giant mirror spanning the wall across from you with some familiar paintings in view. There's a blank wall to your left, but the mirror's reflection shows a painting with a few snowmen on that same wall. Jumping into the wall will take you to Snowman's Land. It was such a smart way to convey that there was a secret in the room, and I just find it incredibly charming. Of the 3 main power-ups in the game, 2 are unlocked for the first time in Peach's Castle. To get the wing cap, you'll need to stand in the center of the main room and look directly into the beam that the sun is emitting. To get the vanish cap, you'll have to head through a specific door in the basement and ground pound these 2 posts. This drains the entire moat surrounding the castle, which then allows you to enter a hole to the level. There really isn't any consistency to how you access the levels these power-ups are in, and that's something I love about them. It requires you to think outside of the box and use your imagination. Though Peach's Castle may be emblematic of this, I believe that this applies to the entirety of the game. Tapping into your imagination is what gives each and every playthrough the sense of variety the game touts. The primary reason that Super Mario 64 has remained in the hearts and minds of millions across the world is how it makes you question what's possible within it. Part of the allure of these stages is that you never know what you're going to get yourself into in search of the next star. The title of each mission is all you're left with to direct you. These titles offer little hints as to what you can expect, and they used to get my imagination racing as a kid. A couple I've always liked are Swimming Beasts in the Cavern in Hazy Maze Cave, Secret of the Haunted Books in Big Boo's Haunt, and Mystery of the Monkey Cage in Tall Tall Mountain. That's yet another thing I enjoy about this game's open structure. There's a palpable sense of achievement after obtaining the stars. Linear obstacle courses are fun in their own right, but discovering the challenge in a non-linear fashion contributes to the feeling that you're crafting your own unique adventure. The epitome of this idea is when you find an entirely new section of a stage you had no idea even existed, namely the town in Wet Dry World. A first-time player's understanding of this stage will be that it's just one giant vertical box, until you find a tiny little tunnel in one of the corners that brings you to an expansive town square. There's an eerie lack of any living things here. It is bustling but simultaneously empty. This always made me wonder, what is this place? And what happened here? Why are the only sentient beings left these water bugs? How did the entire town become flooded? And why is the skybox this ominous purple color? The interior of the pyramid and shifting sandland also made my imagination run wild. The bottom of the pyramid is well below the ground outside, so what else could be under? Could the pyramid's boss be some kind of mummy or ancient spirit trapped inside its current form? Who built this pyramid, and where are they now? I absolutely adore that this game houses major areas inside of random objects or walls. The secret slide level and Snowman's Land entrances had me checking every corner for any other secrets I could find. It's why I feel such a strong bond with Peach's Castle. Additionally, each stage has the ability to evoke different emotions from the player, based in part by how intact their imagination is. It's often said by people who prefer the original N64 version of Majora's Mask to the 3DS version that the abstract art style of the original contributes to the game's atmosphere. It amplifies just how creepy everything is. I also think that this is true for Super Mario 64, but not for the spookiness. Everything is so colorful and vibrant, but also simple, so your imagination has to do a lot of work to interpret the setting. It sells the feeling that the game is taking place in a dream or an alternate universe, and it's partly why I love this game so much. This also extends to how you think about the objectives themselves. Thanks to the flexibility afforded to you by the movement system, there are a multitude of ways you can acquire the stars. You can completely skip having to get the metal cap for the Jetstream stars in Jolly Roger Bay and Dire Docks by continuously swimming at a very specific angle. You can skip the cannon in Whomp's Fortress by performing a wall jump to get this star. You can skip the entirety of the surface in Shifting Sandland by triple jumping up this hill and sliding down to get to the pyramid. You can jump to the second level without the staircase in Big Boo's Haunt, and so much more. Most of these are techniques that skip content in the game, but perhaps some of these methods were intended by the developers after all. Perhaps they just wanted us to use our imaginations. We've all heard that video games are a form of escapism, but I believe that the opposite can be true as well. They can be a way to express yourself in one way or another. But that feeling is at its strongest when the game affords the player freedom, while also encouraging them to test the limits of what's possible within it. Being let loose into a non-restrictive world allows you to play at your own pace, to come up with your own means to getting stars, to spend countless hours just playing around with the movement systems. It's why so many of us identify so strongly with Mario as a character, despite being essentially a blank slate. It's why hearing a simple wahoo brings with it a flurry of memories from what feels like a distant past, but at the same time just a few short years ago. I had never played anything like Super Mario 64 on my first playthrough, and I'd imagine many other people feel the same way. But it's why it sticks out so strongly in my memory to this day. A lot of games that are credited with being the first of their kind or as important stepping stones in video game history haven't aged gracefully. But the fact that this isn't true about 64 is a testament to its quality. It may be a little rough around the edges, but the fact that it launched the collectathon genre into the mainstream and can still be enjoyed today by somebody unfamiliar with it is worthy of my praise. Mario 64 has a certain magical quality to it that I don't think any other 3D Mario to date has rivaled. It's the culmination of all the elements of the game I've discussed that create this feeling for me. It's why I'll continue to replay the game time and time again. And to think that all of this was achieved on a little toaster from the mid-90s makes it all the more special.